Hello, welcome to this deck tech of the Ur-Dragon, and we are doing this only because it has been popular for so long, and that does beg the philosophical question of why is this card so popular if it is so expensive? Well, that might just be because people are building the decks and not really actually playing with them. So I'd like to know if you do have a deck with the Ur-Dragon in it, why? But here it is, and I think the popularity is clear. People want to play with all the dragons that they can find. Thing is, I think there are better ways to play a dragon deck. But okay, the Ur-Dragon, we need to look at its mechanics. It has an eminence ability, where it says as long as it is in your command zone or on the battlefield, other dragon spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So that means that your 9 mana dragon will now only cost 8 mana. Basically, I'd say yes, it's useful, but mostly for the smaller dragons. And what you really want to play this deck for usually is for the big dragons. So not really on mechanic, on flavor. But then whenever one or more dragons you control attack while you have the Ur-Dragon on the battlefield, draw that many cards. Then you may put a permanent card from your hand onto the battlefield, and that is for the big dragon. So I think that is the fun part. But the Ur-Dragon does cost 9 mana and 1 of every color of mana. So that does mean that he will be pretty hard to cast. So a lot of our deck will be revolving around having the right colors out and about ramp, basically. So the themes that we have in this deck are mostly about creatures, draw, and ramp. We have some protection because it can be nice to have multiple turns with dragons out, but mostly we want haste in order to attack with the dragons. I have thought about this a little bit, but I think if you are building the Ur-Dragon as a deck, you want to collect the dragons that you think are fun to play with. I would say pick maybe 10 to 15 dragons that you really love to play with, and make sure that they are as killy as possible. So for example, you can put in the ancient silver dragon. It is really expensive, even more expensive than the Ur-Dragon apparently, and it says when it deals combat damage to a player, roll a d20, draw cards to equal to the result, meaning you can draw 1 to 20 cards and you have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. So luckily you don't have to play them immediately with all of those big dragons out on the battlefield. But if you don't have this dragon, I wouldn't say necessarily go and buy it. So that's the case for many of these dragons. There are some that you could still buy in many cases, like Atarka World Render, which is all about being a dragon. So I think this is very flavorful to play. It says whenever a dragon you control attacks, it gains double strike, so that can be a great finisher. If your dragons aren't really blocked, Bladewing the Risen says when it enters, you return target dragon from the graveyard to the battlefield. Of course, such recursion on top of being a dragon is great for this deck, because it can be easier to play with the Ur-Dragon out at least. Let's see, we have Goldspan Dragon, which is a bit more expensive but doable, and can be played in many other decks that are about treasures and stuff like that. It's also not the most expensive mana wise, so it will be 4 mana in your deck, meaning you can pretty easily play this and ramp out into your next dragon. So I think this is sort of a necessary evil, let's say. Lethless, I really like personally, says whenever another non-token dragon you control enters, create another 5/5. So that's a strong one. Miriam is a great commander, I would say, as an alternative to the Ur-Dragon. 6 mana, and then whenever another non-token dragon enters, create a token that's a copy of it, but it isn't legendary, so you can have your old Gnawbone, if you have it, enter and get 2 of them. So bit of a win more card, but many dragons basically are. I would say Ramos is really interesting. 6 mana dragon that says when you cast a spell, put a +1 counter on it for each of the spell's colors. So playing your commander means you get 5 counters. You can then immediately remove them to add 2 mana of every color, meaning you can pretty easily cast most of your other dragons after that. So there are a lot of cards, a lot of dragons that have become so expensive because they are good in this deck, I would say. And if they are good in any other decks, they will rise to the top of the most expensive cards possible. So that's why I say pick the fun dragons that you can find in this deck, I would say. Your commander is already really expensive. If you want to really optimize this deck, there are a bunch of ancient dragons that are really good, like the ancient silver dragon I showed you before. And I think another thing you really need in here is a card like Terror of the Peaks, because it says whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals damage equal to that creature's power to any target, meaning you have some reach to kill your opponent with. I think cards like that are really needed, and other than that I would say find the dragons that you think are fun. The other parts of this deck are more of a deck part, but the dragons are so expensive, I would say pick the ones that you can get. I put in for draw Bitter Reunion. It's not really about the draw just as much, but it says for 2 mana discard a card, draw 2 cards, so that's fine. You also get a card into your graveyard, and in this deck I think recursion is a big part of how you are going to play your really big dragons. But also says for 1 mana you can sacrifice it to gain haste, to give your creatures haste until end of turn, and that's just 1 extra mana on top of that dragon that you did get a discount on from your commander. So you have that 1 mana lying around. You can give your creatures haste and win the game that way, because you need to get in with your dragons quickly, because they are often very easy to remove. Garruk's Uprising gives your creatures trample if they need it. They have flying of course most of the time, but can be necessary if your opponent has a bunch of jump blockers that are flying. But also gives you card draw whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield, so that means all of your dragons. Kindred Discovery says when it enters, choose a creature type, and when then you play a dragon you get to draw a card, so that's another possibility. Corlessa isn't really card draw, but is advantage, because you may cast dragon spells from the top of your library, so I would say a must include almost. Then Monstrous Vortex, a newer one from the Modern Horizons set, really not that expensive but works really well in this deck. Says whenever you cast a creature spell with power 5 or greater, which most dragons are, discover X, where X is that spell's mana value, and because they are so big you can often get a really big creature after that. Sarkhan usually don't really put many planeswalkers in decks. This one is expensive again, so bit of a question mark. Basically it's expensive because it works with dragons. Says draw a card, then add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Fine. Drawing cards for 1, adding mana, also good, but also can put some dragons onto the battlefield, and I think we mostly love that. Sarkhan's Triumph, I think, is a must include. It says search your library for a dragon creature card, reveal it, put it into your hand, so basically you can pick any answer to your opponent's cards. Pick one that deals damage to remove some creatures, or pick one that can win you the game through card draw like Tiamat to, well, win you the game. Up the Beanstalk is one that has been popular lately, so has gotten more expensive, but once it gets out of standard I think it will drop down again. Says for spells with mana value 5 or greater that you play, draw a card. And World League Tutor, I think really expensive again, but again you have an expensive deck, so maybe you want cards like this. Also just a card that looks for any creature this time, but basically just as good as Sarkhan's Triumph in this deck. It's cheaper of course, but mana wise, but really a lot more expensive money wise, so choose what you can get. I've put in a bunch of expensive lands in here as well. I would say look through it, but not going over them all. I would say the Triumphs are better than in most decks because you definitely need a lot of colors and you need a lot of fixing as well. So for example, Ketria Triumph is really good here because you can get the forest out of your deck with many of your ramp cards, and then you will have 3 of the colors that you will need for all of your other creatures. And other than that, get what you can get. Basically all double colored lands will be good in this deck. Definitely if they have 3 or all. Recursion. There are more cards that serve the purpose of recursion, but I've put in Aerial Ultimatum as the only ultimatum I think in this deck. It's because return any number of permanent cards with different names from your graveyard to the battlefield. In Commander that means all, and this will be a finisher if you have a bunch of dragons in your graveyard. Protection I've put in. Again, this is an expensive section most of the time, so Teferi's Protection is really expensive. Not saying you need it, because you also have, for example, Heroic Intervention on a bit lower level, or for example Boros Charm, which can give your permanents indestructible, or Archmage's Charm, another charm that will help you counter a spell, for example, is a way to go about it. Can draw you some cards if you need it, or can even gain control of target non-net permanent with mana value 1 or less, so stealing your opponent's Soul Ring. Or maybe Mox Jasper is one thing to do. You need a bunch of ramp, but mostly in the ramp section I would put a bunch of cards that will have multiple mana colors, so like Arcane Signet. I think Chromatic Lantern doesn't go in all decks. Sorry. Doesn't go in all decks, but it should go in here because it will give you all the colors that you can get. Dragon Speaker Shaman really isn't ramp in that way, but says dragon spells cost 2 less to cast. There are multiple ways to do that, so that will help you cast a bunch of dragons, not the 5 color ones usually. Cards like Farseek, which can get you most colors, not direct forest, but with Triome you could get forest basically. Herald's Horn I really like here because it makes your creatures cheaper, but also lets you look at the top card of your library and get a dragon if you need it. Mox Jasper is a new one that will add 1 mana if you control a dragon already, so helps if you have another dragon that is cheaper, like Corlessa we saw before, which is just 2 mana, but then you can ramp with the Mox Jasper. Orb of Dragonkind, which is an easy way to add 2 mana in any combination of colors by paying 1 mana, so you don't net 2 mana, but still can filter. You only can cast dragons with this mana though, but has the additional advantage of being able to sacrifice it to look at the top 7 and reveal a dragon card, put it into your hand. Rampant Growth, of course, classic. Rivas of the Claw, 3 mana for a Fiashino, so not really a dragon, sadly enough. But can get you 2 mana in any combination of colors to cast dragon creature spells. And once during each of your turns, you may cast a dragon creature spell from your graveyard, so other recursion as I said. Smuggler's Surprise I really like here because it's 1 mana and then 5 mana on top of that to put up to 2 creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. And 6 mana for 2 big dragons, that's a steal. Sneak Attack, definitely flavorful with the dragon in its art here, and 4 mana for an enchantment, and then 1 mana to put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield and attack with it once. With haste, but also that's just enough for you to win the game usually, so I think, or to at least deal a bunch of damage. So I think you shouldn't be scared of discarding your cards and then getting them back later. Soul Ring, of course, I think this is one of the worst decks to put it in, but I'd still put it in. And Urza's Incubator, which is another way to make your dragons 2 mana cheaper. I've put in a bunch of haste enablers, like Dragon Tempest, which is the best one. Says creatures with flying that enter the battlefield will gain haste. So not all of your dragons, but most of your dragons will. And whenever a dragon enters the battlefield under your control, it deals X damage, where X is the number of dragons you control. You won't have that many dragons, but that's still a bunch of damage that it can deal, and it's direct, and it will give your creatures haste. Lightning Greaves is a good one because it's 0 to equip. Rhythm of the Wild will give your creatures haste. and make them uncounterable, which is important because your opponents will know that you will play big creatures, so they will know that they will need that counterspell for your dragons. And Tamar Ascendancy, also flavorful because it's from Tarkir, of course, but also will give your creatures haste and will draw your cards for creatures with power 4 or greater entering the battlefield, which dragons again mostly are. Board wipes, a bit less than I usually put in, but definitely creature wise, but I would say you often can use them before you put your dragons onto the battlefield, but then you won't need them, and I've put more removal in that will ramp you as well. So, or will be lands, something like that. Vandal Blast doesn't even target creatures, it targets artifacts, or can destroy all artifacts, of course, so that's a good one. Grixis Command, 5 mana to destroy each creature with power 2 or less, which helps when you have dragons onto the battlefield that have more power, but can also make sure that each opponent sacrifices a creature with the highest power among creatures they control, a bit more targeted, or can give your creatures +1 counters and lifelink, which can definitely swing the game for you. Dam doesn't have to be a board wipe, so it can be overloaded to be one, but can also just be a targeted removal spell, which I like about this one. And Crux of Fate also doesn't remove your dragons necessarily. Good if you need it. But can also destroy all non-dragon creatures, meaning you destroy your opponent's creatures and not yours, so that's definitely a good one. You can again see this is so niche usually, but it's again $6 to buy in real life. This one, Leyline of the Guildpact, is I think an interesting one because, well, usually it's not that good, but it's 5 mana, or it's 5 colors of mana. You can also use just green mana in there, and it will also be playable, but if you have it in your opening hand, it begins on the battlefield, if you want to. And its ability is most important. Each non-land permanent you control is all colors, that's one thing, but also lands you control are every basic land type in addition to their other types, meaning you can have your, at least your basic lands. Definitely should remove this from the deck. I'm sorry. Removal. That is very important here because, again, I said I went a bit less hard on the board wipes. So cards like Swords to Plowshares, Path to Exile you can use from the white mana that you have. You have some counter spells, which aren't really removal, but Mana Drain I think is really good here because you will get that colorless mana from it by countering a big spell. Jwari Disruption I've put in here, but can also be a land. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 1. And then actual removal, Fracture to destroy an artifact, enchantment or planeswalker. Vita Swarm to destroy target creature or enchantment an opponent controls. The Spark to exile target permanent with mana value 4 or greater. And Darksteel Mutation to basically remove a commander from the game. Binding the Old Gods can also ramp you by searching for a forest and put it onto the battlefield tapped. And Anguish the Unmaking, which exiles target non-land permanent, you lose 3 life. Reason why, and I think that's something to learn from, I removed that Leyline is because I immediately thought, well, you don't really have that many basic lands in your deck that I put in here at least. I'd say, well, there are 11 forests that I put in here. I've put in so many more forests because I thought I would have way more green ramp, but that's actually not the case. So you can check this here. You can see that I've put in way too many green lands actually, and should maybe put in a bit more of red lands. So maybe we'll go 9 forests here and 2 more mountains. That's usually how I go about it. Just look down here and see the fact that we still have more green lands than red, and so many more red costed spells. So I think that's really interesting about Architect. Definitely recommend it. But also we don't have that many basic lands. So Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe put in an extra land. I think that's not bad in this deck. Yeah, well, that's how I go about it usually. But I thought I would have way more green ramp cards, but I've put in more artifacts, so that's an interesting part. Let me know what you thought about this deck, how you would change it, and we can go about it that way. Definitely recommend you not flaming me in the comments, but telling me what you would change. And usually I change these decks on Architect live with your recommendations, so let me know. And with that, I wish you a very nice day. Thank you for watching.